In none of the stories that I've shared with you from Israel's history, in not one of them did Israel want to totally walk away from God. They wanted to add to God. Y'all just think about that. I know not everybody here just grew up around the Bible, but for those of you that know kind of the story of Israel, the brief history leading up to this moment, just think about it. From the Exodus, they've never trusted me. A few days after the Exodus, God brought Israel by means of a pillar of cloud by day and pillar of fire by night. He brought them to Mount Sinai to give them the law. Moses went up into the mountain to receive that law, and he was gone a few days longer than Israel thought that he should be. So the people panicked, and they demanded that Aaron, who was like the vice Moses, the second in command, they demanded that he make for them a golden calf so that they could have a God to protect them like the other nations. Now, y'all just think about what they had just seen a couple of weeks before. God had delivered them miraculously by means of the plagues and the Passover, delivering them out of slavery from Egypt without them even lifting a finger. And then he had destroyed the entire Egyptian army in the Red Sea, right, without them doing a single thing. And now you're saying that God is not enough to protect you and provide for you, that you also need this golden calf? Then as they made their way from Mount Sinai through the wilderness, they started to complain that they wanted to go back to Egypt where they had fresh supplies of water and gardens that they could grow vegetables in. This was despite the fact that God had promised that he was taking them to a land that overflowed with milk and honey, and every day before they got there provided them by means of manna that was spread out on the ground. And whenever they needed water, he would make it miraculously gush out of whatever rock that Moses spoke to. Yeah, but that wasn't good enough. God's promises were just not enough. So here they are again, 1 Samuel 8, and they're still saying, God, you're great and everything, but you're not enough. We need a king like other nations who can go out for us and fight our battles. What is especially ridiculous about this right here, right now, is that in the chapters leading up to chapter 8, which we skipped over, God had just defeated Israel's greatest enemy, for the land of Philistia, the Philistines. He had defeated them by means of a cart and 2 cows. God had let the Philistines, here's a quick story. God had let the Philistines steal the Ark of the Covenant as a punishment for Israel's persistent unbelief and disobedience. This story is told back in chapter 4 if you want to read it later. That was the fulfillment of what we looked at last week, where God promised to punish Israel because of Eli's disobedience. But just as quickly as they lost the Ark of the Covenant, God brought back the ark to them through no effort of their own. It's actually a pretty entertaining story. After the Philistines had captured the ark, they put it in the temple of their god, Dagon. Well, the next morning, Dagon's statue was lying face down in front of the ark with his hands chopped off. They thought, well, that's weird. So they set Dagon back up, taped his hands back on. Next morning, same thing. Then all the men of the city, where the Ark of the Covenant was being held captive, all the men of the city woke up the next morning smitten with tumors. So the men of the city are like, get that thing out of here. And the Philistines take the ark to a different city, and the same thing happens there. Eventually, the Philistines are like, get this thing out of our country. It causes problems everywhere it goes. So they put the ark on a cart, and they attached it to a couple of young cows, and the cows miraculously turned in the direction of Israel and walked the ark straight back to the Israelites. Israelites did not do a thing. With no battles, through no effort, the ark just showed back up on their back porch, carried along by a couple of Philistine cows. It was utterly amazing. Get that, right? Sorry, I knew I had to milk this one, okay? Hey, what do you call it when a cow jumps over a barbed wire fence? Utter destruction, okay? All right, moving on. Here we go. The point is, when you have a God who fights for you like this, why do you demand to have a king also? Couldn't you trust this God? I mean, that's the entire point of chapters 4 through 8. On one level, these chapters are kind of silly, and the author intends for them to sound silly, but they make a very serious point. Israel has a God who fights for them. Why isn't that enough? And sure, they have an army, and one day God's gonna give them a king, but they're not supposed to trust in those things. They're supposed to trust in the God behind those things. Their security was not supposed to be found in the size of their army like the other nations, or their identity was not to be found in the glory of their king like the other nations. They were supposed to find those things in God. Now listen, this is important. In none of the stories that I've shared with you from Israel's history, And not one of them did Israel want to totally walk away from God. They wanted to add to God. They needed something in addition to God to feel secure and significant and at peace. And that leads us to a very important insight. If you're writing stuff down, write this down. Usually we reject God, not by walking away from him. Usually we reject him by adding to him. Usually we reject God not by walking away from him, but by feeling like we need to add something to him in order to feel safe and significant. I would guess that that is true for the majority of people, if not every person listening to me right now.